problems, of improving the performativity of the system and of its efficiency in its institutions, of seeking the optimization of the system with no higher end but improving that functioning. But so it would seem that is simply awful. The only game in town in such conditions would seem to be a vicious and literally demoralizing economic neoliberalism and political managerialism. The imperative of every form of neoliberalism is be operational, that is, be commensurable within the norms of the privileged domain, or disappear. With economic neoliberalism, what Lyotard calls the terror associated with this hegemony, the terror that this hegemony produces on participants is, Lyotard would say, hard and utterly unforgiving. And as Husserl anticipates, it all seems despairingly hopeless, rendering our existence fundamentally pointless, tragically meaningless. But perhaps the situation really is not so hopeless. In the face of this new situation, if we're to learn to see it as other than the total disaster that Husserl worries about, I think we need to learn two things. First, and Pache classical liberalism in its third step, we need to learn to see that the idea of living a worthwhile life, what Husserl calls a meaningful existence, really does not depend on the truth of a teleological philosophy of history or grand narrative. And second, here Pache economic neoliberalism in its first step, we need to learn to see that the performativity of the system in general does not have to be construed in terms of the institutions of business, in terms, that is, of the limitless extension of economic reason and the logic of the market. In our time, what one might call the historical task will indeed be modest. Instead of striking out towards a final end of history, the task is merely one of optimizing the performativity of the system, of avoiding it all crashing down round our ears, of it not going totally off the rails, just like it nearly did and still might. However, the realization of performativity in the long run is also more complex than this suggests, or simpler. It has to reckon with what happens if people who are going to have to be operational within the system really don't want to be, or become so disinclined to participate that they go on strike, or riot, or revolt. Performativity in the long run, what Lyotard describes with Parsons' organic metaphor of viability, is not, I would suggest, compatible with the hard terror regime of economic neoliberalism. Nevertheless, performativity, maximization of the system's long-term viability, is, whether temporarily or permanently, we do not know, the only game in town. The legitimacy of those holding political power will reside overwhelmingly in such a case in claims to greater efficiency, of optimizing the system's performance, of improving functioning with respect to viability. I think today we are all, in this minimal sense, becoming neoliberals. But in what richer sense should we be? And here I'm going to offer some alternatives that I'm going to call the varieties of neoliberalism. Here's the first one, which, historically speaking, has been moving towards a hegemonic position. Whether the current financial crisis will mean the end of that, we don't know. But here it is: Homo economicus, economic neoliberalism, the limitless extension of economic reason to every sphere of life. This is something proposed almost evangelically by the Washington School. And the aim here is to maximise utility. Historically speaking, the phase of economic neoliberalism, it gets its real push from the Thatcher-Reagan era and beyond. A second variety of neoliberalism, homo politicus, political neoliberalism. Here we have the idea of the limitless extension of political reason to every sphere of life. A great example of the political neoliberal is Lenin. Again, excuse the anachronisms, conceptually speaking, he was. And the aim here is to maximise actual equality. So it's the norms of politics will be the norms for the whole of life. Historically speaking, the becoming hegemonic, although never completely so, of a political neoliberalism can be seen to begin at the onset of the Enlightenment. The democratization of society begun in the Enlightenment through the French Revolution up into the 20th century in various forms of democratization, and the radical democracy of the Lenin being the kind of high point or low point, as it were, of that movement. Homo romanticus, never a successful movement in itself. Aesthetic neoliberalism, the limitless extension of aesthetic reason to every sphere of life. The aim, as it were, to maximise beauty.